The wind that evening moved like a weary traveler across the Wyoming plain, dragging the last heat of day toward the darkening horizon. It carried the dry rasp of grass against grass, and the faint metallic groan of a wagon wheel turning on its side. The wheel was half buried in dust, spinning only when the wind pressed hard enough to shift it. Beside it, a woman sat with her knees drawn up and a small child curled against her chest beneath a fraying quilt. Clara Belle Dawson's hands were raw from the sun, the knuckles cracked where the skin had split. She pressed them over her daughter's back, as if she could shield the child from more than just the cold. 6 days on the trail had worn her thin, but the last 3 had stripped her hollow. Her lips were dry enough to sting when she tried to lick them, and the canteen at her side was as light as a hollow bird's bone. Lily stirred under the quilt, her breath hitching in the restless way of a child trying to stay asleep despite discomfort. The girl's hair was the pale gold of wheat left too long in the field, unbrushed since they'd left Cheyenne. Clara whispered something soft, half lullaby, half prayer, but the sound died in the open air before it reached the child's ear. She could still see Silas's back as he rode away that morning 3 days past, shoulders hunched as though the very act of leaving was a burden he didn't deserve to bear. The dust his horse kicked up had clung to her skin long after he'd vanished into the flat horizon. He hadn't looked back. Not once. His voice still rang in her ears when she closed her eyes, low and bitter, telling her she was too much trouble, that dragging her and that girl any farther would cost him his freedom. The last thing he'd taken, besides the horse, was the little hope she'd managed to keep stitched together. The prairie around them had a silence that wasn't quite peace. It was the kind of silence that made every heartbeat sound too loud in the ribs. Clara had tried walking earlier, thinking maybe the thin black line of cottonwoods she could just make out to the west meant water. But the sun had been merciless, and each step had pulled more strength from her than she could afford to lose. By the time she'd stumbled back to the quilt, her legs had trembled under her like a newborn foal's. She knew the signs. She'd seen thirst strip the breath from men before, back in her father's days running freight lines, and she could feel the edges of it pressing in. If it were just her, she might have let it take her. But Lily's thin arms around her waist were the only anchor left in her world. The light began to shift, the horizon blooming in colors no one had names for, all dust and fire and violet haze. That was when Clara heard it, soft at first, just a faint rhythm beneath the wind. Hoofbeats. Steady, unhurried, coming from the north. Her breath caught. Men on horseback out here could be salvation or ruin. She reached for the old rifle leaning against the broken wagon bed, knowing full well there was only one cartridge left. Her hands tightened around it as the sound grew louder. Lily stirred again, pressing her face into Clara's collarbone, and Clara felt her own heartbeat quicken in answer. Through the heat shimmer, a figure began to take shape. One man, tall in the saddle. The horse was a deep bay with a deliberate gait, not the reckless rush of someone hunting trouble. Dust curled at their feet like a ghost following close. He came closer until she could see the lines of him. Broad-shouldered, clothes worn but cared for, the brim of his hat pulled low enough to shade his eyes. The rifle felt heavier now, though she didn't raise it. The man drew the reins and slowed, the bay tossing its head once before standing still. He didn't speak at first. Just sat there letting the horse breathe, looking at her, and then at Lily with a stillness that was almost uncomfortable. When he did move, it was to reach for the leather flask at his side. He swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion and crouched, holding the flask toward her. She hesitated, suspicion warring with need. He waited without pushing, his gaze steady, the kind of patience that felt like it had been earned through years of weather and quiet. Slowly, she reached out, took the flask, and tipped it to Lily's lips first. The girl drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and only when she was done did Clara take a mouthful for herself. The water hit her throat like something alive, sharp and cold, almost making her cough. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him. His face was weathered in the way of men who'd worked the land long enough for it to mark them. Creases fanning from the corners of his eyes, a jaw set more in thought than in pride. He finally spoke, his voice low and even. Said he was Elias McGraw, had a place south of here where a roof still kept the rain out and a stove still worked. Said there was no sense in sleeping under open sky, with the wind biting, and the coyotes prowling close. She glanced at the broken wagon, the useless wheel, the wide nothing on every side. Pride was a stubborn thing, but so was fear for her child. Still, she didn't answer right away. He seemed to understand the silence for what it was, because he didn't fill it with more words. He just stood, dusted his hands against his trousers, and looked out toward the cottonwoods as if the choice were hers alone. Lily shifted against her, looking up with those wide eyes that hadn't yet learned to mistrust kindness. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint, far-off howl of something that would not hesitate to take what was left of them. Clara's breath came slow, heavy in her chest, and then she nodded once. Elias didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased. He lifted Lily into the saddle first, settling her in front, his big hands gentle around her small frame. Then he turned to Clara, offering his hand. She stared at it a moment, the skin darkened by sun, the fingers nicked with old scars. Taking it meant stepping into something unknown, but so had every step she'd taken since the day Silas left. She put her hand in his, and he pulled her up behind the saddle with an ease that made her realize how long it had been since she'd been held steady. The leather was warm under her palms as the horse shifted beneath them, and for the first time in days, the horizon didn't look like the end of things. It looked like it might hold something yet. They rode into the deepening dusk, the wind behind them now, carrying away the dust of the trail and the echo of her husband's parting words. The cottonwoods grew closer, their leaves whispering like old voices. Somewhere beyond them lay whatever came next. Somewhere beyond them, she dared to hope, there might be a place to stop running. And as the first stars pressed through the sky, Elias turned slightly in the saddle, his voice low but certain, telling her they'd make it before the night got too cold. It wasn't a promise of forever, just of tonight, and for Clara Belle Dawson, that was enough to hold on to.